Jakarta. Welcome to today's FPCI and BSAT public discussion on revisiting ASEAN-led mechanisms amidst armed conflict and elections in Myanmar. My name is Anastasia, and I'll be your MC for today's event. The Center for Southeast Asia Studies, or in Indonesian, Pusat Studi Asia Tenggara, is a think and do tank that conducts research and programs on issues related to maritime and Southeast Asian affairs. To keep up with our activities, you can follow us at FPC Indo and BS Asia Tenggara on Instagram and subscribe to BSAT on bsat.center. Today we welcome our distinguished speakers for the discussion, Professor Dewi Anwar, co-founder of FPCI, Dr. Mo Tuzar, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of Myanmar Studies Program in ISEAS, Singapore, William Sabandar, COO of IBC and Head of Reconstruction Operations in Myanmar from 2009 to 2011, and Michael Vatikiotis, Senior Advisor in Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. We also welcome our moderator, Jenny Sariwinata, Acting Secretary of PSAT. Apologies. We appreciate everyone joining us here today in person. So moving on to the public discussion. Today we will dive into revisiting ASEAN-led mechanism amidst armed conflict and elections in Myanmar. With the ongoing conflict and instability in Myanmar, revisiting the 5-point consensus is highly urgent, and it has been 5 years since the peace plan has been agreed upon. Additionally, the recent visit from the ASEAN Special Envoy from Myanmar to Yangon during Myanmar's election period in January 2026 has raised questions about ASEAN's response and strategy forward. Before we begin, I would like to invite Ambassador Iwan Wiranata Atmaja, Supervisor at BSAT, to provide insights and on the issue as an opening remark.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm supposed to welcome you on behalf of Padino, but since he is here now, I still will do it. Okay, distinguished participants and colleagues, welcome to FPCI and PSAT public discussion. Pusat Studi Asia Tenggara, or Center for Southeast Asia Studies, is a think and do tank. We focus on conducting research and program on Southeast Asian and maritime affairs. Our latest project is the Hashim Jalal Archive. It is an online archive where Professor Hashim's life work that includes journals, articles, and speeches are digitized, preserved, and open to public view. Our other program include public discussions, much like this program. Today, we are going to discuss the Myanmar issue entitled Revisiting ASEAN-led Mechanism Amidst Armed Conflict and Elections in Myanmar. We have with us today distinguished panelists, and I recognize Professor Dewi Fatima Anwar, co-founder of FPCI, Dr. Mo Tuzar, Senior Fellow in ICS, William Sabandar, COO of IBC, and Michael Vatikiotis, Senior Advisor in Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and Jenny Sariwinata as Acting of Secretary of PSAT. Let me begin with a central question. Can ASEAN still effectively lead the resolution of Myanmar crisis, or is its leadership being constrained by structural limitations? Since the 1st February 2021 military coup led by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, Myanmar has moved beyond political instability into armed conflict. What began as a power struggle between the military and civilians evolved into a nationwide confrontation involving the junta, ethnic armed organization, and pro-democracy resistance forces. The conflict is now structural, not episodic. In response, ASEAN adopted the 5-point consensus in April 2021, calling for cessation of violence, inclusive dialogue, humanitarian access, and appointment of a special envoy. However, implementation has been limited. Violence continues, political dialogue remains stalled, and humanitarian access is constrained. First and foremost, the gap between commitment and compliance highlights the structural limits of ASEAN's traditional diplomatic model, one rooted in non-interference, consensus, and quiet diplomacy. These principles have preserved regional stability for decades. However, in the context of an intense intrastate armed conflict, they may also restrict ASEAN leverage. The organization can facilitate and persuade, but it cannot compel. Secondly, the elections season adds another layer of complexity. In principle, elections can serve as instruments of legitimacy and normalization. However, if conducted amid active armed conflict and without full political inclusivity, risk deepening fragmentation rather than fostering reconciliation. Myanmar's own experience under Aung San Suu Kyi reminds us that electoral victories alone do not guarantee democratic consolidation. Thus, ASEAN faces a strategic dilemma. Endorsing the elections may risk legitimizing a contested process, while rejecting them may appear inconsistent with its non-interference principle. Revisiting ASEAN-led mechanism does not mean abandoning the ASEAN way. Rather, it suggests adaptation, possibly through more flexible engagement, stronger humanitarian coordination, and closer collaboration with external partners. Ultimately, Myanmar is a stress test for ASEAN. The question is not whether ASEAN should lead, but whether it can evolve sufficiently to remain credible and effective in managing complex international conflict. I thank you very much. I look forward for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Iwan. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, allow me to invite Professor Dewi, Dr. Tuzar, Mr. William Sabandar, PhD, Mr. Michael Vatikiotis, and Jenny to come on stage and start the public discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We were just chatting with our friends and colleagues in the foreign policy community, and we were just talking about how the Myanmar issue, we were worried that it's getting clouded by what's happening around the world, and there are lots of conflicts around the world that are gaining more headlines and attention, and it's either drowned in distraction or in fact in fatigue, because 4 years ago or 5 years ago there are more headlines and discourse on Myanmar, and we realized that this year, within these recent years, it's getting drowned by distraction and fatigue. So we're glad that we're having this conversation with the right persons on the panel, and let's get to the gist. I'll start with Dr. Mo Tuzar. Can you update us about the situation on the ground at the moment, and especially with the developments of election recently? And did the election change the dynamics at all?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jenny, for setting me this task. But first of all, let me take the opportunity to thank FPCI and PSAT, and of course, Pak Dino's leadership for, I think, really keeping the attention on a topic that I think we in this region do care about, and also, of course, helping highlight why it's still important to continue caring about Myanmar 5 years after the 2021 coup. And I know it's in the context of the post landscape of staged managed polls that have been organized over December 2025 to January 2026. And so any reference or mention that I will be making when it comes to elections, I'll be using them in scare quotes. And that comes from someone, who has consistently voted for change since 1990, in a previous life, you could say, growing up as a young adult in Myanmar. Now, the questions you set me is to actually talk about this post-landscape, if you will. I'm going to borrow the campaign slogan from the 2008 Obama presidential campaign, "Change we can believe in." So I think what we need to be aware about, of course, is the election process that the State Security and Peace Commission in Myanmar has presented as a reset. The narrative of, it's a reset, borrowing from past playbooks of a transition to civilianized or semi-civilian type of administrative arrangements. This is the kind of the narrative and the presentation that external interlocutors, the region, the world has been given. And the point there is, of course, expectations that there will be some developments for change that will happen that might, again, open up opportunities for greater engagement and interaction and all that follows afterwards. So that's why I was going back to that point about change we can believe in. Since 2024, the Myanmar Studies program at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, ICS, the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, we've tried to do some key informant interviews with people in the country to really gauge sentiments. And what we've been hearing mostly is skepticism expressed about genuine change emerging out of such a process. And of course, leading up to the polls, after the polls, updating with these key informant interviews, what we've seen, of course, what we've heard, learned is, I think the majority of the views we've heard, they don't really see change that we can believe in as likely or possible. And I think, when Pak Iwan mentioned legitimacy just now, I think legitimacy or support, I think it's kind of lost meaning because people, I think, in the country do see it as somehow futile in that sense. And, at the same time, we need to recognize that people are weary, people are tired of conflict, and of course, there is this fatigue that sets in after 5 years because of, I think, the very severe economic, socio-economic and humanitarian challenges that communities in the country face. So what do I mean by that? I mean, there is, as mentioned by Pak Iwan as well in the opening remarks, conflict is continuing in intensity as well. Just 4 days ago, we heard about this massacre in a village against civilian communities where, they were even asked to dig their own trenches. And it's horrific. So you see and hear this, but I think, in an environment where I think a lot of such images, stories of horrors happening to people around the world, I guess, the bandwidth that we have to see this and to hold this in our minds, of course, is another question. But the point I wanted to highlight here, the first point about, is it change that we can believe in? And the second point about conflict continuing in intensity. It may have lessened in frequency, but it has certainly continued in intensity, affecting unarmed civilian communities. And so the third point, before we move on, the civilian protection and humanitarian needs, which I think Pak Iwan also highlighted, they're mounting. And various United Nations reports have highlighted this already. It's not numbers from me, it's from the UN agencies monitoring this. There are 20 million people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. 1/3 of it is children. over 1 million refugees living across the border in different countries, neighboring countries, since the coup. That number has increased since the coup. Of course, it started, I think, mounting with the 2017 Rohingya exodus after a disproportionate military crackdown. Since the coup, since 2021, there are 3.6 million, close to 4 million internally displaced persons in the country. And that is a direct result of the conflict that's been happening. And something that maybe doesn't hit us so much, but what I've been hearing also from Myanmar stakeholders, the HIV and AIDS recurrence rate since the coup have increased tenfold. Resistance to TB and malaria has increased sevenfold. Myanmar is now among the countries with the lowest vaccination rates for children. And I could go on. There is modest growth for economic, the economic growth being posted, but we need to remember that there was a negative 18% when it came to Myanmar's economic growth post-coup, post-pandemic. And I think various experts, economic experts, have also highlighted that the Myanmar economy is the only among those in Southeast Asia that hasn't recovered fully from the pandemic. So I think we really need to put that into context when you ask me about this scenario of the situation, the landscape in 2026. Maybe I'll stop here and we can revisit some of the points later on.
Thank you. Before we move on, Dr. Motuzar, just one quick follow-up question as well. Reportedly, there are more than 2,600 ethnic and rebels group in Myanmar, and currently only 21% is covered by the military across the country in terms of territory and control. Can you also explain how is the political map in Myanmar currently evolving? Because certainly the main opposition, yes, it's NUG, but it's not just NUG, and how is the dynamics among them as well?
Technology Luddite. It's interesting you bring this up, and you've kept track, of course. But I think the context here is when we talk about the civil war situation in Myanmar, we need to also recognize that since 1948, since Burma gained independence in 1948, almost immediately after independence, the country did start experiencing, armed resistance or pushback from ethnic armed organizations, ethnic armed groups, and that number of the ethnic armed organizations, there are about 16 or so major ethnic armed organizations that were in some form or another of ceasefire negotiations during the previous decade of opening, and some of these groups that actually signed a nationwide ceasefire agreement withdrew from that agreement post-2021, post-coup. And of course, in response to the lethal force used against unarmed civilians in the weeks, months following the coup, there have been, I think, violence against violence. So what we have seen is this armed resistance. And there has been a proliferation of many local defense forces, people's defense forces, as they call them. Some come under the chain of command of the National Unity Government, NUG, broadly representing the resistance. But there are also different ethnic armed organizations still very much resisting, again, the military for their own interests and so on. So Myanmar has been in a situation of civil war, if you call it, particularly among the peripheries since the post-independence years. Of course, what we have seen since 2021 is that civil war situation really spreading across the country, even into central parts of the country that used to not experience this kind of situation before. So I'd like to set that into context before you're talking about this control. So if you talk about territorial control, or I'd like to bring in administrative control as well. The State Security and Peace Commission military regime still maintains administrative presence and control in all the state and region capitals in Myanmar. But if you look at the on-the-ground situation, I don't really want to go into percentages because the situation is dynamic, it changes, but the kind of updates that we've been hearing or monitoring really places the townships under what's called the resistance administration or control, whether it's like fully under that kind of administrative presence and control, or partly among the different resistance forces and the ethnic armed organizations, that's over 40% roughly. And then there are townships that are experiencing active resistance. This is a mixed kind of situation. It's also where I think the dynamics on the ground can show different territorial administrative presence and entities. Add to that, that's another about, I guess, 20 over %. And so then the townships under the administrative presence and control of the regime in Naypyidaw, then you can kind of like guess at it. But as I mentioned, I don't really want to go into all these specific numbers at that time, because the situation, the dynamics, they're fluid. But this is the landscape. And I think some of the audience who may have seen different maps, even the recent maps showing the areas where polls were conducted and the areas where polls were cancelled, will give you a good idea also of, I guess, that reach of the administrative control. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you for the overview. But Michael, 5-point consensus clearly is not progressing substantively. What can ASEAN do differently?
Well, I think first of all, following on from Mo's very detailed presentation of the landscape inside Myanmar, I think it's important to point out from a historical perspective, this is in many ways the most complicated, complex landscape of conflict that the region has had to deal with. There was, of course, the Vietnam War that preceded ASEAN. There was the Cambodian Civil War that happened under ASEAN's watch, so to speak. But the Myanmar conflict, as Mo points out, is one of the 2 longest running civil wars in the world. Preceding by 1 year is the Palestinian conflict, Israel-Palestine. Myanmar, they're both 70 years old. So this is, and of course it's also true to say that ASEAN has had to deal with Myanmar in the past. Before Myanmar was a formal member of ASEAN, there was the 88 uprising and its aftermath, and there was, a whole dealing with the transition after 2011 onwards, which was a relatively good period. So to put it in perspective, this is the most complex landscape of conflict that this region, Southeast Asia, has had to deal with. And then if you ask, well, what about the regional response? I think the first thing we have to realize is that Southeast Asia is a region where one of the most important principles is sovereignty. Sovereignty is a hallowed principle in Southeast Asia. Unlike the European Union, which of course has dissolved borders and tried to make itself more of a community, Southeast Asia still has its 10 countries that are very much countries in their own right, and there's no question of developing an integrated community. Sovereignty is the defining principle of ASEAN, which makes it very difficult to deal with internal conflict in other countries. In fact, ASEAN is not geared towards doing that. But it is a security issue for the Southeast Asia, and therefore they have to pay attention to it because, as Mo was pointing out, there are cross-border implications, and there are also political implications in terms of larger states that are neighboring Myanmar and how they respond to the conflict. I think it's fair to say, and I'll say I'm a critic of ASEAN policy towards Myanmar, because I think it's kind of not succeeded in coming up with an integrated form of conflict management and resolution, which many people felt that that's what they ought to do. The first response to the coup in 2021 was, of course, to immediately condemn the coup and alter the way in which Myanmar, as a member state of ASEAN, could interact with the other member states. A form of exclusion, if you like. And then under Ibu Retno's management of the foreign ministry in Indonesia, when Indonesia was chairman, I think she felt it was very important to come up with a strategy to deal with Myanmar, which she did in a consensual sort of driven way, so that this is where the 5-point consensus emerged, where the aims of the 5-point consensus were to bring about a reduction of violence, addressing the humanitarian situation, all the things you would expect in a regional response. But the problem is that, come back to sovereignty, how is ASEAN supposed to deal with an internal conflict when the mechanisms for doing so in ASEAN are simply not there? They're not even there when it comes to dealing with interstate conflict in the region. Perhaps they should be. But the internal conflict in Myanmar is not covered by the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. It's an internal issue for Myanmar. So these are the technical obstacles and challenges to ASEAN's response. Now, one can go into detail about who did a better job as chairman, who's been a better envoy, but I would sort of highlight two things. First of all, it's been up to individual countries, specifically Thailand and Indonesia, to fashion their own policies towards Myanmar based on different considerations. Thailand is a frontline state and therefore has to deal with the state of Myanmar across its border, as well as Mil was pointing out, a huge influx of refugees, and as well as whole areas of ungoverned space along its border. Not to mention the great power implications of China's intrusion into Myanmar in the last few years. So, Thailand as a state, as a member state of ASEAN, had to fashion its own policy. What I think is very interesting is how Indonesia, since its chairmanship of ASEAN, has actually developed its own approach to the Myanmar conflict, which is to establish an office of a special envoy for Myanmar, which has provided Indonesia with the space to use its own good offices with respect to Myanmar and conduct a series of dialogues, very low-key dialogues, with what they refer to as the Myanmar stakeholders, but often includes also the state, in order to look at how to address the conflict. It's a straight line approach, which Indonesia feels that it's important to do. I will not comment any further on the ASEAN approach because I think it's very much a moving target, but I have to say, in terms of what has this produced since 2021, I think it's probably fair to say, other than the humanitarian contributions that ASEAN has made, I think it's not actually affected the conflict very much.
Thank you, Pak Michael. Speaking of ASEAN, I want to raise the issue about special envoy. Pak William, you had been before the special envoy for reconstruction in Myanmar. You know the inside out of what it's like to operate as a special envoy. Should we revisit the role of special envoy or the authority of one special envoy has to deal with the issue in Myanmar? Obviously, there's a question of long-term and short-term special envoy, but currently, based on the last chair statement in the Philippines ASEAN chairmanship, the last ministerial meeting, there was a statement saying they're in deliberation of setting up a long-term special envoy. But based on your experience, what things you would raise as a point of evaluation?
Thank you. I'll use my engineering hat because I'm not coming from this community, and I wasn't sure at that time why I was appointed as special envoy. But it's in Indonesia. You might call it. It's not in the ASEAN structures, but it's coming from the engineering process, and for me, and I learned from my Aceh process. Yeah, you cannot solve the sophisticated problem with unsophisticated approach. So like Michael said, this is one of the most complex crises in the world. So if you have a standard approach like what ASEAN is doing right now, for sure, that won't solve the problem. So ASEAN become irrelevant. So let me go back to the history in 2008, and this is a combination of three. One is momentum. You have momentum. Number two is leadership. And number three is actually actions that deliver impacts. That's how I would like to see a successful operation. And this is why in 2008 you have a political opportunity where there is a constitutional referendum happen, and at the same time there is a cyclone Nargis. which created a space at that time for ASEAN to get into the political process at that time. And when the Nargis struck, I think that was the innovative process of the ASEAN leaders, get the foreign ministers, collect. Myanmar at the first time doesn't want to engage, but because of the pressure of the international world, then they have to acknowledge the role of ASEAN instead of the UN and the international world. The right to protect forced by the French foreign ministers at that time put Myanmar in the situation they have to accept. So there is a momentum at that time. But then the momentum at that time was driven by the leaders, and ASEAN need leaders. And this is something that lacking in the ASEAN Sudan, the leadership. And at that time, I think it was the Singaporean, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, the President Yudhoyono at that time, working with the Jo Chiu as the Foreign Minister of Singapore. So there is a special Foreign Minister meeting. It was another innovative approach by ASEAN. Special Foreign Minister meeting in Singapore because of those pressure. And with I remember at that time with the Minister Hassan Wirayuda, Indonesian Foreign Ministers, and they pushed Myanmar to receive this. And then that momentum followed by appointment of the Secretary General of ASEAN, Surin Pitsuwan, at that time. And not in 1 week after that, it's followed with action. 2 weeks, we do the international conference, the donor conference in Yangon. And that create the open. So what ASEAN bring at that time is actually open the space, open the access for the international community to come in and put Myanmar government in the situation they have to accept that situation. And this is actually, when I refer back, it was similar to the Aceh process, Aceh peace process. At the same time the tsunami happened, it's actually the momentum that create, and then you have the leadership, you have the combination at that time, the president, Yudhoyono, vice presidents, and the man on the ground, Kuntoro Mangku Subroto, that push action on the ground and make an impact. And that happened, and then the rest is history. That was not being repeated after that. So you have the 5 PC in 2021. It's a document. There is no operational framework that translate that commitment, the principle, into action. You have the special envoy, but this is special envoy that not works. So how can you expect to solve the very sophisticated issue with the unsophisticated approach? And that's the failure of ASEAN. So if ASEAN wants to be relevant, for me, they have to change the way they operate. They have to be innovative. They have to be what I call political engineering. They have to see the way of having to do with addressing the member state issues using the approach that is really see, number one, the leadership of the chairman of ASEAN, strengthening of the Secretary General, because in the ASEAN Charter, there is a statement that this humanitarian head can be actually be implemented in that situation if the leaders giving like this. So this kind of thing that I hope with the 5 PC we can still continue, but it's lacking the operational framework. It's really just the document, and if this happen, I don't think we will solve this issue. So special envoy is one, but really special envoy that create operational framework, the presence on the ground, and this will open the trust, they will build the trust, open an access, open the dialogue. And I remember I should acknowledge the role of TNCN at that time, because then becoming easier for me. I don't know. It's then when the foreign ministers ask, and then we can have the conversation. Task the foreign ministers to open then and giving the access of visa. So at some point there should be a collaboration between the leadership in the country with what we have. So I believe this. We need a momentum. We need a strong leadership, both in ASEAN and if we can find the leadership in Myanmar that work on this, and try to find the way to make sure the special envoy thing is working.
Thank you, Pak William. You put emphasis on a very important point here, leadership. It's one thing to talk about the way an institution operates, but now you talk about leadership. Prof. Dewi, what's your sense on the leadership? What's your stance on the political will and the leadership of Southeast Asian leaders today, including our country, Indonesia, in getting their attention and getting their hands on Myanmar conflict?
Yeah, Jenny, I've listened very carefully to all three. I mean, this is all very interlinked. But before that, I've just remembered when Michael and talk about the complexity of Myanmar. James C. Scott has this very interesting book out. It's called The Art of Not Being Governed, an Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. So don't dream of ever governing upland Southeast Asia because they don't want to be governed. So in that sense, we need only to focus on the areas that are willing to be governed and are governable. Yeah. So Mo, I'm sorry. In Zomia, that part of Southeast Asia, they want to escape from the reach of the modern state. But so when now we are focusing on the issues of Myanmar, where between the NUG and the military, and also the regional areas, which are still willing to come to the table if they are given the right framework. And I think this is it, and here when we talk about ASEAN, Michael emphasizes this sovereignty as being a hallowed principle. Yes, but ASEAN is not ASEAN 67 anymore. So we thought that, with ASEAN 67, we would never even agreed on the idea of integration, economic integration, or let alone a community. But we move on. We do have a charter. And within the charter, when Pa Iwan mentioned, the ASEAN way and so on, people tend to emphasize only the ASEAN way of respect for sovereignty, non-interference principles, territorial integrity. But they forget that the charter also includes the democracy, protections of human rights, constitutional government, yeah? And that is already in the charter, which is signed by each and every single member of ASEAN. They've ratified it through their parliament. So what does it mean? Sovereignty is not going to be absolute, yeah? So on economic issues, no country is sovereign anymore, let alone Indonesia. Don't let us talk about that at the moment. But even when it comes to political sovereignties, there are international law that we have to submit to. We can't go around committing genocide and not expect ourselves to be held accountable by the international court. Your president can be arrested, can be accused of being perpetrators of war crimes. So I don't think that sovereignty is absolutely absolute. After all, it's people sovereignty, not state sovereignty only. So here, I think that we need to go back to the spirit of the ASEAN Charter here, and not look only at the primitive declaration in the beginning only. So I am still a strong believer in ASEAN, and if we want ASEAN to be credible, we have to believe in how far ASEAN can go. If we're going to say there's nothing ASEAN can do, okay, just throw your hat to the ring and say, okay, this is not an issue that ASEAN can do. Like, if you are like an investor, the market tanks, what are you going to do? You're going to hold on to your investment, but forget about it, or sell off. Now, in my case, for Myanmar or for any other ASEAN members, ASEAN should be able to use the leverage. And here, maybe we could be much more transactional. What is in it for Myanmar to be in ASEAN? Does it want to continue to be a member of ASEAN? If yes, then I just read Mo's paper. I'm an editor of a book, and Mo's paper is one of that. The responsibility to implement. And in her paper, Mo said that Myanmar is very good now at emphasizing its rights about protection, non-interference, but it's forgetting about its responsibilities. Yeah. So here, ASEAN needs to play hardball with the hunter. What exactly do you want? Do you want to be completely sent to Coventry? If that is the case, then Myanmar will not be an issue for ASEAN as a regional organization. It will not be our concern as a member of ASEAN, because as long as Myanmar is a member of ASEAN, it holds up a lot of the ASEAN progress, and ASEAN is held accountable all the time for the mistakes in Myanmar, mistakes which is of independent rival of ASEAN. So now ASEAN is in a bind, and here, it comes to this political leaderships within ASEAN. ASEAN needs to be tougher with itself and with its members. Now, with leadership, it means not to allow the ASEAN only to be run by bureaucrats, because bureaucrats then, they know the details, they know what to do, but political leadership, the strong leaders, need to come out here as well. Here, people tend to look at Indonesia, and I read that Pak Prabowo actually mentioned something about Myanmar at the ASEAN summit. Yeah, sorry.
That's Prabowo calling.
Yeah, no, that's my alarm. Yeah, and he talked about ASEAN maybe sending some peacekeepers to Myanmar and so on. So in this case, I think that don't look at the 5-point consensus as a holistic whole. I think that is our mistake, that we look at 5-point consensus and, oh, it's not working. Maybe we need to disaggregate what can work and what cannot work within the 5-point consensus. So cessation of hostilities. So maybe, we need, how far do we go, and do we have measures? What kind of measures do we have? And either carrot and stick in the relationship. In this way, because ASEAN does not have enforcement mechanism, this is where we need to work with our dialogue partners. We keep saying that, and they keep saying of ASEAN centrality. What does it mean? Do they defer to ASEAN in their Myanmar policy? And here in particular is Russia, China, and India. So ASEAN needs to be able to talk to dialogue partners as well. If you actually believe in ASEAN centrality, do talk with us also what you're going to do towards Myanmar. Let's have, a more coordinated approach. And within ASEAN, you can do both. Remember the Cambodian conflict. So Indonesia's policy was not in line with the ASEAN policy of bleeding Vietnam white at the time. So the Indonesian government did a dual-track approach. The Foreign Ministry followed the ASEAN policy of putting a lot of pressure on Vietnam or for the Cambodian issue, but the military, who was sent by the same boss, by President Suharto, went to approach Vietnam. And then ASEAN adopted formally Indonesia's position as interlocutor, and Indonesia carried out that Jakarta informal meeting. I think this is one of the best practices that we can do. This can be done, if possible. If it's not Indonesia, I don't know whether Thailand has the appetite, but somewhere who is trusted. But you need to move on or move out. So in my case, I don't think ASEAN should allow itself to be held hostage. But the Myanmar issue, its reputation is totally damaged about it, and we are judged by our failures. And that kind of failures, if you continue to have failures, you lose heart. And I believe that here, be much more transactional. What do you want? What can ASEAN get out of you? What benefits you bring to ASEAN? What is your value in ASEAN? Instead of just saying, what can ASEAN deliver for Myanmar? What can Myanmar or any other members of ASEAN give to ASEAN as well? And if not, maybe we'll recalibrate, your being part of the original organization. And also, be more clear talking to our dialogue partners as well. And this is what is lacking within ASEAN at the moment.
Thank you, Prof. Dewi. But Michael, first of all, I want to respond to what Prof. Dewi has mentioned about the carrot and stick that ASEAN can do in in dealing with the Myanmar issue. But also, secondly, since Prof. Dewi as well mentioned dialogue partners, how do we factor in the relations to external countries, including China, Russia, and where is US and Europe in this conflict? And please share your observation about that.
Well, on your last point, I think it's fair to say that after 2021, there was still a fairly strong UN system that was in place that joined with ASEAN. There were several discussions that took place in New York, where the ASEAN member states were a central part of, to try and work out a coordinated approach. But of course, in the last 2 years or so, that energy and enthusiasm from the UN side has somewhat receded, with all the problems that the UN has faced universally, and the multilateral system generally. Then there was the important role played by some dialogue partners of ASEAN, the United States in particular, which immediately mobilized after 2021 to sort of try and see what could be done in terms of humanitarian aid in areas where the conflict was raging. And that actually was by and large a very important component of the assistance that was provided to especially areas that were controlled by the resistance after 2021. But as we know, USAID is no more either. So there's a huge gap there in terms of aid. And then there were a string of other countries. Well, of course, China has played a very important role, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, where they've woken up to the fact that their borders, with their border with Myanmar, which is an important gateway for trade, not just trade with the immediate area, but also the passage of minerals and from the coast of Myanmar and outline other areas in Myanmar to China. It's a little known fact that 60% of China's heavy rare earths are sourced from Myanmar now. The ores are mined in Myanmar, and they're mostly in resistance-held areas. And so this has forced China to become a much bigger stakeholder in the conflict itself. A wise person said to me that, you know, as all things in China, they look at things through a historical perspective. And for a very long time, the management of China's borders, land borders, was essentially managed by local security working across the border to make sure that they had all the big power holders across the border under their control. So there's always been a kind of external element to China's border management, going back to, you know, the 16th, 17th century. And so what you see today is that China has done that in a big way. They've gone initially to support certain of the ethnic armed groups operating in areas close to China to make sure that they have good relationships with them. Then also to negotiate ceasefires with those groups. And more recently, they've taken a huge bet on the regime in Naypyidaw, believing that the election process itself might bring about some kind of political change. So China is a huge actor. India less so. India has never really had a forward-looking policy eastward. India looks rather inward at its own region and has not really done very much across the border in Myanmar, although they have important border gates in northeastern India. Bangladesh, of course, has had a very important role to play through the whole Rohingya crisis because they have consistently seen themselves as the main recipient of Rohingya refugees, and their policy is that these refugees must return. And this has always been a problem between the state of Myanmar and Bangladesh, because the Bangladesh government considers the Rohingya people the people of Myanmar, whereas various governments in the state of Myanmar have considered them not the people of Myanmar. So that's, I think, a general picture of the neighboring states. Coming back to China, I think one of the problems that ASEAN has faced in trying to deal with the conflict in Myanmar is that the Chinese have a very awkward relationship with ASEAN on this issue. You know, even though China is a very important and long-standing dialogue partner with ASEAN, when it comes to Myanmar, China has very specific interests, and it doesn't really see this as a regional problem as such. It sees it as China's problem with its borders. And therefore, the conversations with ASEAN, with China, have not been all that deep or effective. And of course, China has also, in the last few years, preferred to develop its own platforms of regional cooperation on mainland Southeast Asia, the Lanchang Mekong platform, which sort of slight discomfort with the sort of dealing with ASEAN as a regional association in areas close to its border. I think that sort of gives a picture of the larger international position. I think we mustn't also, I mean, Mo may have more information on this. We mustn't also forget that the state of Myanmar has relied to a very big extent on Russian aid, particularly ammunition and servicing the Air Force and providing the munitions for the ongoing campaign. There was recently a very big Russian delegation of naval vessels in Myanmar, and that's an important relationship as well. Otherwise, I think ASEAN has been in the front lines, it sees itself in the front lines, because two of the states in ASEAN, Laos and Thailand, are frontline states, and so I think that's puts it very much in the ASEAN court.
Thank you, Pak Michael. Just want to throw one data that could be useful for us related to what Pak Michael said, that based on CIPRI's report on 2025, just last year, last 2 years actually, it was 66% of military spending from Myanmar. It was a spike, and it was the rate of the increase in terms of percentage of GDP is the second highest after Israel. And that is surprising to see that one of ASEAN countries is at the top list in CIPRI's report. I want to turn to Pak William to respond later on, but one follow-up, Pak Michael. Where is the UN Special Envoy's role here, which is now Julie Bishop, the former Australian Foreign Minister?
Well, I think it relates to the first point I made about initially the UN was very closely involved, but of course with all the problems that the UN has faced in the rest of the world in terms of the deterioration of the multilateral environment, I think the UN role has somewhat diminished. That's not to say that UN OCHA and other agencies, UNHCR, UNICEF, for instance, and World Food Programme are not heavily involved in dealing with the humanitarian situation. But I think it's fair to say that the UN's diplomatic agency has somewhat weakened.
Thank you, Pak Michael. Pak William, the carrot and stick of how ASEAN can use this and game out the carrot and stick in dealing with Myanmar issue, what would you suggest?
It's a challenge, but it can be also an opportunity for ASEAN. If we still do the same approach, then ASEAN will continue to lose trust and credibility. ASEAN, if you cannot solve your internal issue, then how can you be credible to outsiders? And I think the challenge is actually questioning ourselves as ASEAN members, as ASEAN, whether we can solve our problems. And that's what Budewi said. This is we need to go back to the charter, but prospecting what is actually the value of regional organization amidst the geopolitics of the world today. So for me, ASEAN can remain central, but it must prove that ASEAN can solve ASEAN matters. And I still see 5-point consensus as, let's say, as a frame, as an opportunity to work, but it must be reformed. ASEAN must reform itself in order to make 5 PC works for Myanmar. And for me, the key is actually how to transform that 5 PC into an operational framework. And this, if I mention more in a more technical ways, what does it mean? The 5P consensus should have, number one, they should have an operational framework with implementation discipline. So they have to have a benchmark, timelines, regular reporting, consequence of compliance and non-compliance. They should build the office in Myanmar. They have to push this, and I think the leaders can push this. It happens during my time. Why cannot happen today? Yeah, I still this. And then the second one is ASEAN must engage all relevant stakeholders, not only one side, because you have so many stakeholders, and they should recover. Yeah, for me, some kind of Nargis approach, the breakthrough, pushing to the limit. And of course the situation is different, but trust building and trust building will create access. This is using ASEAN way. Myanmar people will trust more the ASEAN leadership than other. So why cannot? I still don't understand why we ASEAN don't use this capability, the trust that built by people, yeah, by others, not just the government, but people-to-people interaction is actually the strong point of ASEAN. And I remember if you can develop this people-to-people communication, then the trust from outside world, yeah, that will be the confidence that we give. And I think greater unity is important because without unity there is no leverage, and greater unity for me is about leadership. Honestly, I don't see any hope, but you have to solve it. This is an opportunity. While the structures of the world order is changed, and we don't use this Myanmar case as the window for ASEAN opportunity to leverage itself, to develop, and then we really lose the momentum. And this is the time. ASEAN chair, ASEAN leadership needs to think. And for me, today is the Philippines. I don't know, but I don't see hope. ASEAN Secretariat, Secretary General of ASEAN, Indonesia will have an opportunity to decide the Secretary General of ASEAN. Indonesia must choose ASEAN Secretary General that really can play, not just approaching the government to government, business, people to people, and that will actually leverage the unity of ASEAN. So this is what I think ASEAN should have, and I think this our responsibility as the people of ASEAN to continue to echo and to convey this message to the leadership of ASEAN. We have the responsibility to say, ASEAN have the opportunity, it should stay relevant, and if you want to stay relevant and be useful for the people, you have to change the way you operate. So that's the point.
Of course.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not part of this panel, but because you raised a very good point. So when I was working for President SBY, we had the same dilemma, right? And there were a lot of pressures towards Senior General Tan Shui at the time. And the challenge for us was, there was a sovereign country, and we can't impose on them what to think, what to do. It's not a colonial relationship, right? So that was the challenge, and there was no communication or trust at that time, right? So what we devised was something interesting. We devised a personal correspondence mechanism. So President SBY wrote a personal letter to Senior General Tan Shui. Nobody knew about it. We didn't publicize it, but basically saying, look, you're doing your 7th step towards democracy, and I think this is your problem, and I'm your friend, and I understand your problem, and I suggest you do this. And guess what? We got a response in writing. We were very surprised. And then SBY wrote back, and he wrote back. And then SBY wrote back, and then he wrote back with some churhat. Churhat, apa? Like a
Heart-to-heart dialogue.
husband telling a wife, or the wife telling husband, and then it became quite constructive, and we never told him what to do. So we respected the sovereignty, but we established trust without posturing. And we believe until now, and again, we never published this, we believe until now, Tan Sui's decision to reach the 7th step to democracy, the elections, Aung San Suu Kyi was part of it, and so on. We believe we had some part of it because he had the trust and advice from a country that was important to ASEAN. So I think, in response to your message, I think that's what's needed now and can still be done here.
Thank you, Pak Dino. Prof.
Agree,
Devi,
agree.
you want to respond? Yeah.
More probably will not say, but I'm quoting from Mo's writing. There are two perceptions from by people in Myanmar towards ASEAN. So you can clarify that. So ASEAN is perceived to be interfering already by the government because ASEAN is giving it limited sanction, not allowing that to be part of ASEAN summit. But I've talked also to a number of NGO in Myanmar. They're living in exile. They hate ASEAN. They burn ASEAN flag now. You know why they hate ASEAN? Because they are very disappointed with ASEAN for not doing enough to help the people. So this is the choice. If ASEAN is going to be people-centered and people-oriented, are you going mostly to please the government and to be really very soft and velvet approach and not ruffle any feathers? Or are we going to talk also to the people who are the real constituents of ASEAN? Now, so I do believe that this inclusive outreach, which is part of the 5-point consensus, should be done. And here, the envoy, we have been talking ad nauseum about the need for ASEAN to have an ASEAN envoy, not an ASEAN chairs rotating envoy, and to have the envoy's office located at the ASEAN Secretariat. So if Indonesia has its own office of special envoy, it should also be latched to the ASEAN Secretariat so that the memory is shared. So if you don't need to have only one envoy. You can have maybe, if you can, one envoy to reach out to the generals, one envoy to reach out to the ethnic groups people, one envoy to reach out to the activists in the country, one who can reach the diaspora, but you have to have a clearinghouse within the ASEAN Secretariat where you have to have an institutional memory. Diplomats come and go, but they do have to need that institutional memory. So you can, and then, they can have a collective. But it has to be an ASEAN one. And they already talk about it in Malaysia, and they're still talking about it, and I don't know, how long they're going to talk about it. But if you don't change the way they do things, you're going to have this very uneven phase. You have a strong chair of ASEAN, and then you have a good envoy, and then you have a weaker chair of ASEAN, and then, there's not much going on. So I believe, I keep saying that, I believe in tough love for ASEAN. If you love ASEAN, you need also to make sure that ASEAN lives up to its potential, and not really this lowest common denominator, and we don't expect much from ASEAN. Therefore, if it's just if got an F, it's fine. I frankly don't believe, because it's young people, they are going to lose trust in ASEAN, and it is going to be much more consequential for the region.
Last question before we open the floor for the public to give Q&A. Dr. Motuzar, I'd like for you to respond to the previous conversation, but also that the fact that even during the election in Myanmar, ASEAN couldn't figure out whether to send observers or not, which as small thing as that is already one thing that shows divisions among the ASEAN leaders' stances. And so how would you suggest then with us having different approach, each of the Southeast Asian leader now want to re-strengthen ASEAN's role on on Myanmar, sorry.
Very easy question. No, but facetiousness apart, I think trying to, listening to Pak Michael, Pak Willie, Bu Dewi, I think a few points here that I'd like to add to the conversation thus far, when we're talking about perceptions or attitudes towards ASEAN among the different Myanmar stakeholders. I think we need to also differentiate that there is the time, the situation in place, and the agency, and this is not static. So what happened in 2008, of course, which was I think the late Dr. Surin Pitsuwan said this was ASEAN's defining hour in that sense, because the Myanmar regime at that time kind of backed down and said, as long as ASEAN coordinates the humanitarian assistance delivery, we will accept. And from a position of, ASEAN hands off, right? I mean, I'm essentializing it, but that's basically what the response was at the time. But that's 2008. And ASEAN being able to put humanitarian boots on the ground was in the context of a devastating natural disaster, a cyclone that happened. So what's happening now in Myanmar post-2021 is different, yeah? It's human-induced, it's happening across the country. On top of that, there have been natural disasters, like we saw the March 2025 earthquake, where ASEAN also offered assistance, and it was accepted. And there were some hard negotiations that I think the Malaysian Defense Ministry had to do to reach areas where the Myanmar regime in Naypyidaw did not want, I guess, different humanitarian assistance teams or response teams to go. So there were these things. And I think in 2008, the process or the framework for such negotiation, such access, that was set there. So what I'm trying to get at is that, if we look at it, successive administrations in Myanmar and the different ministries and departments do have an institutional capacity and advantage of dealing with ASEAN. Dare I even say manipulating the ASEAN diplomatic space. And so they know from the 2008 experience, if they say, oh, as long as ASEAN coordinates, we will accept humanitarian assistance from ASEAN. And they've used that post the 2017 Rohingya exodus. That was on ASEAN's agenda even before the post-2021 situation got onto ASEAN's agenda. So I think we need to see also how ASEAN, like Ibu Dewi said, can push that advantage to saying, yes, we have these mechanisms, but there are also these obligations, it's not just rights. So I think we need to look at that. And the point that Ibu Dewi raised about this negative sentiments, it is also born of high expectations because of that Nagas experience, because of what they saw the ASEAN coordinated mechanism being able to do. So I think we need to also look at that in terms of the expectations and the disappointment. And I also see it as a learning point that we need to communicate more about ASEAN's intergovernmental bounds, of what ASEAN can or cannot do, and also I think raise that awareness and understanding among the different Myanmar stakeholders on how they can also engage with ASEAN towards meeting some of these very glaring important needs that Michael has also highlighted. So I think that's the point. And also from all the conversation that we've had thus far, I think what we need is not leaders, not heroes. We need champions. Champions who are committed to actually helping the country and the people and trying to find different ways of using their agency to deal with that. And of course, we also need similar champions in the Myanmar context among the different stakeholders. And to that end, I think the point about engagement, it does not necessarily mean acceptance or legitimization, but we do need to engage with all the stakeholders at different levels to get the communication across, because it's a two-way process. And that's how we also, I think, try to get at what are the aspirations, expectations, and needs, and see how we can use our different strengths. Ibu Dewi mentioned different envoys, but we're also using the different strengths and the inroads that we have with different stakeholder communities to bring to bear what can be a collective effort. So I think that's how it is. The IC's Yusof Ishak Institute does these annual surveys. Since 2021, we've included a question on the Myanmar response, the regional response to Myanmar. By and large, the most, I think, the regional preference, the highest preference is for engaging with all stakeholders, including the NUG, to build trust. There is less appetite for non-interference. There is more appetite for mounting a coordinated response with the international community. That kind of dipped, but then it spiked up again. And there is also, I think, more interest or awareness, and these are the regional responses, including, of course, responses from Myanmar stakeholders as well, the Myanmar respondents, I should say, of also, again, using harder measures to convey to the regime in Myanmar that you don't get a free pass, you don't get a hall pass, and just by throwing a sop to ASEAN doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to forget 5 years of atrocities and sweep everything under the carpet. There are obligations, as I was mentioning, as well as rights. So I think we could go on and on and on, but I am aware that there may be questions from the floor as well. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Now I'll open the floor for questions. We'll gather about 3 to 4. In the interest of time, make it short, concise, straight to the question. Ambassador. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Tiffany McDonald, the Australian Ambassador to ASEAN. And we think a lot about the questions that you're all addressing today. Just a reflection and then a question. For Australia, we frame our response around the 5-point consensus in supporting ASEAN's efforts. We continue to provide humanitarian assistance. In fact, the displaced people from the Rakhine state, the Rohingya, it's a $1.28 billion humanitarian program, the largest humanitarian program that Australia has globally. We also continue our development cooperation because we don't want the people of Myanmar left behind. But I'm thinking, hearing the discussions around innovation and champions and the role that ASEAN can play, Indonesia has, whenever ASEAN has rejuvenated itself, innovated, Indonesia has always been one of the, if not the thought leader. What are the prospects of Indonesia being that champion to innovate and to really drive an updated, innovated new response to Myanmar?
Thank you, Ambassador. Next questions? From there, lady with the glass, and then the lady 1 row before that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunities. Actually, my question is kind of related to my final thesis. I actually take this issue, so thank you so much for bringing up this issue. So my question is, since 2021, COP in Myanmar, we have seen the emergence of various actors not only engaging in armed resistance, but also assuming governmental function in specific areas. And in many internal conflicts, the identity of armed groups can shift from resistance actors to local governance actors. In current context of Myanmar, we are witnessing such as identity transformation, and what factors are most crucial in the shift from an identity of resistance to an identity of governance? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady, the first row, yes. Concise, 1 question. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, as Professor Dewi mentions previously, although the member of Asian countries has to uphold non-interference principle, they still need to submit to democracy protections of human rights. But the specific question will be what is the measure that we can say that it's already violating the democracy protection of human rights, so that we can probably to some degree interfere. And the second question, talking about the carrot and stick, as Professor Dewi mentions that ASEAN has been held accountable since Myanmar have behaved in some ways that are not appropriate to Asian principle. What if it's just Myanmar decide to just move out of Asian membership? Does it really gonna solve the problem and improve the regional security? Because the implication will still happening. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. 1 more question? Yeah, okay. Here, 2nd row.
Thank you. She's a very famous war veteran. She traveled to Cambodia during the conflict and so on.
Veteran journalist.
Thank you. My question has more to do with the Myanmaris themselves. If they don't want to be helped, if they don't feel like being united by the ethnic groups together, how can ASEAN address that problem? Does the Myanmar people want to be one country instead of many factions fighting each other. ASEAN had it easy in Cambodia. They knew the leaders. They negotiated with the leaders. Son San, Sihanouk, the Khmer Rouge, and in Vietnam. Who does ASEAN today address besides the junta? Who is in the NUG? Which leaders in the stakeholders, in the many ethnic groups are there that ASEAN can address their negotiations or their diplomatic efforts? I don't see this among the Myanmar people, except for Aung San Suu Kyi, who's in prison. She is the only one who is respected by most Myanmaris. I say Myanmar because if I say Burma, Burmese, she is from the Burmese faction. And then the other ethnic factions will protest. But isn't this a complication that ASEAN faces? The Myanmar people themselves?
Thank you. You don't have to answer one by one, or you want to answer specific questions, you're most welcome. But we can generally answer all the questions at once. We start from Prof. Dewi.
So, Ibu Tiffany, I don't think I should be answering now about whether the prospect for Indonesia coming up with new ideas, rejuvenating ASEAN, because I've been very critical, openly critical of how the Indonesian government now, President and Foreign Minister, not paying enough attention to ASEAN. But I know that there's some people from Kemlu here, so we need to push for the Indonesian leadership. It is regarded as a natural leader in ASEAN. And there's a lot of expectation. So there's also lots of disappointment, not just from within Indonesia, but from our friends in the region and outside who expect, Indonesia should take the lead, because not necessarily leading, but championing. And Indonesia has been one of the best friends of Myanmar, because we do have a lot of similarities in terms of history. We are very diverse. We had similar experience fighting against colonialism and the Japanese occupation, and then experiment with parliamentary democracy, regional rebellions, failure of parliamentary democracy, and then both turned towards military government, except that Indonesia went to the west while Myanmar went inside, Buddhist way of socialism, whatever. But we feel that we are the strongest, and I am a strong believer in the people of Myanmar. Until Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General of the UN, the only Secretary General from Asia is from Myanmar, from Burma, Utan. Yeah, these people are extremely smart, they're extremely well educated. It's one of the the intellectual center, and this is the rice bowl. It's extremely wealthy, lots of natural resources, so they've got everything going for them. So it is a tragedy that we don't see this. So coming to Yuli, if they don't want to be united, what can we do? I think as good friends of Myanmar, I said, no, Indonesia is not God-given to be united, as you know. This is an imagined community. This is something that we can share with the Myanmaris. We don't have to fight all the time, but it means that they probably need to adopt Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, to have unity in diversity, not to impose the Buddhist way on everybody, and not to impose the Burmese way on everybody, But, maybe this is something that we can share. We can share Pancasila, we can share Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. This is something, when you're a thought leader, we might not be doing terribly well, but compared to what could have happened in Indonesia, we are not doing too badly. And when compared to other regions, where even 2 ethnic groups or 3 ethnic groups are still fighting war, I think we are doing really well. And this is something that we can share with them. So they might not be willing to listen, but what is the value of fighting all the time? Yeah, young men should just play soccer and play music instead of being raised to fight war all the time. So in Indonesia, we have the capacity. It's just the political will. The president is all over the place at the moment, but I think that if he's called if he's asked again by some ASEAN members, or to step up, if he's willing to fix problems in Gaza, he should be willing also to help. But here it is important. Indonesia should not act unilaterally. It is not an Indonesian solution. it has to be an ASEAN, a regional solution with dialogue partners, because ASEAN is not living in isolation. And as Michael pointed out, some countries have more leverage. So in this way, I think that we need to be much more focused and much more calibrated about it and much more strategic. And there's a clear division of labor, what Australia can do. Well, forget about the United States. It's the rest of the world minus the United States at the moment in this case. But what can the various dialogue partners do? ASEAN doesn't have the financial capacity or the technological capacity. We can start working together on this. But the most important thing is for ASEAN to believe in itself. So I feel extremely upset when we fail to call on Cambodia and Myanmar to restrain themselves. They say, we should not interfere in each other's Cambodia and Thailand. Yeah. And they said, we should not interfere in each other's internal affairs. This is not internal affairs, this is interstate affairs, which is the reason why ASEAN was established in the first place. That is why we have the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. And for our foreign minister to say, we should not comment on it because this is, it's interfering. And I think that was a bit misguided. So the most important thing is for Indonesia also to get its act together in this. We can still do it, but we have a lot of challenges.
Can I just very quickly ask, as a scholar, and to follow up on Tiffany's question, if Indonesia wants to mediate, and we heard President Prabowo wanting to mediate between Iran and the US and so on, and meanwhile President Prabowo has not had experience in mediation, and neither has Foreign Minister Sugiono. So I'm just wondering, what would be your assessment of President Prabowo's mediating skill? Yeah, because sorry to put you on the spot, but
I don't know, but there's one thing that Indonesia has that many other countries don't have. We used to have military authoritarian system, and now we have a democracy not doing very well, and we still have a military leader as president. But at least within a functioning democracy, though maybe not that healthy, but it is still a functional democracy. The fact that we're talking here, we're breaking critical, and that we are still able to do most things that we do. So remember the idea of, if I'm starting with Pak Joko Widodo, to send some military leader who may talk to other military to military talk, for example. I'm not sure here though whether that would still be open, because the earlier generals were open to that, but I'm not sure with this one. So more can tell us about it, whether there's any value at all. For example, like President SBY writing to Tanshan, whether there's any value at all for the similar approach at this present day between our top military leaders.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so 1 to 2 minutes per panelist. Thank you.
Okay, I think this brings the point where, what we need to think about is a multi-pronged approach. This is what I meant by having champions, not heroes or leaders. So multi-pronged approach means we each, the different ASEAN members bring their different strengths, their different capabilities, and their, unique communication channels for different stakeholder groups, different interlocutors, I would say, not privileging one or the other as the sole or the primary interlocutor, but recognizing that in the current situation, especially since 2021, there are multiple interlocutors in Myanmar. I think which brings me to the other points about, armed or resistance actors transforming into governance actors. This also, I think, speaks to the situation that we've seen where Myanmar, since 2021, has been going through an almost simultaneous process of really trying to find that identity formation, or I should say peace building and state building, nation building, all at the same time. Opportunities that were somehow, not fully realized, or, promises never realized since independence, for the vision of the different, different stakeholders, different communities actually living together in a more loose type of union. So I think that's where the discussions are happening. Why it's not visible, Ibu, is because the stakeholders are trying to build trust among themselves. In the past, the previous military regimes, and I'm talking way back to other military regimes as well, they took the bilateral approach of talking to each armed actor or each ethnic actor separately without sharing what was being discussed with other groups. So there was this kind of very bilateral one main so-called interlocutor in the form of the military leadership controlling the process, and of course having the outgunning option. So what's been happening since 2021, and actually during Indonesia's chairmanship was what started it all, talking to the different stakeholders, including the people sitting in Naypyidaw, but also the different armed actors, the civil society actors, and building that trust such that in Malaysia's chairmanship last year, that could be brought into more thematic discussions around the future, issues for the future, with all the stakeholders. So they're for the first time, I think, the Myanmar stakeholders are experiencing talking and learning from each other, and that's one point that they appreciate ASEAN managing to facilitate that discussion space, and they want that space to continue. So I think that's the thing that I think ASEAN, steering the course can still try to facilitate, but it's not an overnight process. What's happened over 7 decades, I don't think can be solved in a few years. So we need to also look at this, approach this in that medium to long-term perspective, and that's where the political will and the support and the will from dialogue partners who really care about the region, I think, comes into play. Sorry if I took too much time.
Thank you. But William, 1 minute.
Very quick, just Ambassador Tiffany, and follow up Bu Dewi's. I think Indonesia can play an important role because, as Pak Dina mentioned before, there is an experience between two leaders, SBY and Senior General Tan Swe at that time. I think if President Prabowo wants, this can be his legacy by starting developing the communications. Yeah, this is not in the ASEAN framework, but just try to. They are both military, and their approach is a bit the same at the moment. So number one, do that, pay a visit, and you really need to have a strong foreign minister. And this is something that I think Indonesia needs to play a better role in the region. Foreign ministers which innovative enough. So President Prabowo visit Myanmar and really build trust, and then task the foreign minister to really play to activate the 5P consensus, because it was born in Jakarta at that time during the Indonesian leadership. So you are talking about Brunei, yeah, it was this. But the ASEAN Secretariat, yeah? It was used Jakarta, yeah, but it was, I remember. Yeah, but and you mentioned about champions. If Indonesia wants to be a champion, so the President Prabowo, the foreign minister, which must be innovative, not the current one, and then the Secretary General of ASEAN. Indonesia has the opportunity. Is an opportunity, and then those three can actually solve the problem. So it's opening the opportunity to Indonesia play a role to really being a champion in ASEAN to drive the ASEAN solving the issue of Myanmar.
About parity, I think whatever communication, whatever engagement we do with the different Myanmar stakeholders, I think on the part of ASEAN, the principles need to be, the purpose is to help the country and the people. And there needs to be parity when we engage. And we saw this during 2025, Prime Minister Anwar talking to the senior general in the aftermath of the earthquake to push for a humanitarian pause and ceasefire, and the next day also talking to the NUG Prime Minister. And both sides of the political divide knew that there was this going on. So I think we need to have that parity when we engage and communicate, even in multi-pronged ways. Thank you.
But Michael?
Just make two very quick points. There was a question at the back there about the implications for regional security. I think we have to understand that for Indonesia, the conflict in Myanmar is significant because the scam centers that now infiltrate the border areas, and not just in Myanmar, but also Laos and Cambodia, are home to operations that prey on the Indonesian public in terms of online gambling. So there is a direct impact of these conflict areas and these scam centers on the Indonesian economy, significant one. The second point I would make to you, Ambassador, is that Indonesia is already a thought leader. Indonesia paved the way with the 5-point consensus. It was Ibu Retno's thinking behind that. Secondly, as Dino pointed out, Indonesia has a recent track record of trying to persuade the generals, the army in Naypyidaw, to learn from Indonesia's reform process. The answer was very clear. We know your story, we don't like it. But more recently, Indonesia has begun, I think, with its Special Envoy's office, to do exactly what Mo was saying, to look at the medium to long term, to look at the challenges of governance, of nation building, of how to envisage the state of Myanmar, rather than focus on short-term issues like ceasefires and negotiations which are going nowhere. So I think Indonesia is a thought leader, but Indonesia's role is somewhat misunderstood, because often elsewhere in the region people say, well, what are you doing? Why isn't it within the ASEAN framework? Indonesia has a right as a sovereign nation to use its own good offices to address an issue. And I think Indonesia, as a distant, disinterested country with a connection through history, is doing as good a job as anyone else of trying to address those medium to long-term challenges.
I guess that's a hopeful note to end the session. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we have to close the session. Thank you, Pa Michael, Pa William, Dr. Motuzar, Prof. Dewi, for the very productive and fruitful discussion. Hope to continue having this public discourse on Myanmar. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll give the floor back to the MC.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for the engaging discussion as well as the panelists. Before we move, could we just quickly get a panel photo session, please? If you could stand up. We'll take 2 photos on my count. Just 1 second. Oh, yes. The light. Is it this one? No. Is it not on? Just leave it? Okay. Yep. Ready? Yep. Oh. Okay, yep. A bit of a reshuffle. Perhaps if we can shuffle slightly to have space. Yes. Is it okay? Yep. 1, 2, 3. And again. Yep. Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining PS Ate's first public discussion of the year. It has been a fruitful and engaging discussion, and I'm sure the audience found this interesting and highly informative. Please stay tuned for more of our public discussions and other events from FPCI and PS Ate, and please follow us on social media as well. I would like to kindly invite everyone for the iftar reception. The food is served. It is not quite iftar just yet, but you're more than welcome. Go ahead. Thank you, everybody. See you at the next FPCI and PS Ate event.